The sky changed color at 6:14 in the morning, and Elena Cross already had her hand on her rifle before she understood why. It was not sunrise. She had watched enough sunrises on Kepler 7b to know the particular way
Contacts
the
on
light
the
moved
scope.
here. The
Confirmed,
slow
they're closing
amber crawl
fast.
that came from
Prepare
the
to
east
engage.
and spread
Weapons
lazily
high.
across the cloud cover like something being poured into a wide, flat container. She had watched it 300 times in 8 months, and she knew its character. This was not that. This was a burning that moved from east to west, deep and wrong, rolling across the sky as though the atmosphere itself was being peeled back by something enormous passing close overhead. Something that had no business being that close. Something that was not asking permission. She stood outside the barracks with one boot unlaced and her rifle in her right hand, and she stared up at it. And for exactly 3 seconds, she forgot every protocol and procedure she had been trained to execute and simply watched. The way you watch something that your mind has not yet found the category for. Private Cole Danvers appeared at her shoulder. He was 22 years old and had been on Kepler 7b for 4 months and had not yet developed the particular quality of stillness that longer-serving soldiers carried. His voice came out barely above a breath. "Captain, what is that?" Elena did not answer. Her mouth had gone dry. The colony alarm screamed 11 seconds later. Her name was Elena Cross. She was 24 years old when the sky changed color, and she had been stationed on Kepler 7b for 8 months as the commanding officer of a small United States defense garrison. The assignment had come with almost no ceremony. The posting board had listed Kepler 7b as a Category 2 agricultural colony, low strategic priority, standard garrison complement, expected duration 18 months. The briefing officer had described it as a quiet world. Good experience for a young captain. Manageable. He had not been lying. He had simply been wrong about what manageable meant. Kepler 7b was a farming world in the fullest and simplest sense of that description. 60,000 civilians had built their lives in its wide flatlands, growing crops that fed 3 other colony systems and shipping processed proteins back toward Earth on a schedule that had run without interruption for 11 years. The people here were farmers and engineers and teachers and mechanics and children who had grown up knowing nothing but the particular blue-gray sky of a planet that was not Earth, but had become home. There were schoolhouses in the settlement district, in markets that ran on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, and a community medical center that had delivered 412 babies in its 11 years of operation. The United States military presence existed the way a smoke detector exists in a house where no one has ever had a fire. Insurance, precaution, something to have on hand for the occasion that everyone hopes will never arrive. 200 soldiers, 2 orbital patrol ships, 1 relay station in low orbit, no strategic minerals beneath the soil, no weapons research, no classified installations, no reason, in any language and by any calculation, for anyone in the wider galaxy to pay Kepler 7b any particular attention at all. That turned out not to matter. Elena finished lacing her boot in the doorway of the barracks while the alarm was still running, and by the time she reached the command post, Sergeant Major Wade Briggs was already there, standing over the communications console, with his thick arms folded across his chest and an expression on his face that she had learned to read with some precision over 8 months of working beside him. It was not fear. Briggs had spent more years in uniform than Elena had been alive, and he had made a careful and deliberate peace with fear somewhere along the way. What sat on his face now was something more precise, the expression of a man who has studied a particular kind of danger long enough to identify it on sight and is currently identifying it. "Formation," she said. "Coming through the upper atmosphere now." He did not look at her. His eyes stayed on the display. First confirmed contact approximately 40,000 meters and descending. Moving at a rate that should be generating considerably more noise than it is. How many? 14 confirmed. A pause. More still entering through the upper atmosphere. Elena looked at the secondary display. Both patrol ships showed offline simultaneously. The orbital relay station showed offline. No debris signature on either. No distress signal. They had not been destroyed in any conventional sense. They had been stopped, the way you stop a clock by removing the battery, clean and immediate and complete. "Earth Command," she said. "Dark, every channel." He finally looked at her. "Whatever is up there, it knows precisely what it is doing." She pulled up the external sensors and studied the first vessel breaking through the cloud cover below the amber burn. It was enormous. That was the first and most complete impression. Not enormous in the way of the large military craft she had studied in training, the carriers and destroyers that were constructed to project size as a form of communication, as a statement of intent. This was enormous the way a geological feature is enormous, without apology, without design, simply existing at a scale that made the surrounding sky feel smaller by comparison. It was deep gray-black, shaped roughly like a curved talon, and it moved with a smooth and absolute certainty that communicated everything before a single word was spoken. It had not come to threaten. It had not come to negotiate anything. It had made a decision somewhere far away from here and long before this morning, and it was simply arriving to collect on a decision that had already been finalized. The broadcast began before the ship had fully descended. Every channel activated simultaneously. Not just the military frequencies, all of them. The civilian bands, the agricultural coordination networks, the personal communications units that 60,000 farmers and engineers and teachers carried in their pockets. Every screen and every building on Kepler 7b lit up at the same moment, and the voice that came through them was delivered in 37 languages at once, overlapping in a way that should have been incomprehensible and was instead simply relentless. A wall of identical meaning delivered through every available opening. Elena heard it in American English. She would learn later that the choice of primary language was deliberate for each world targeted, calibrated to the dominant population's linguistic center of gravity with the kind of thorough research that communicated, in its own way, how long they had been watching. Attention biological inhabitants of designated Harvest Zone 74 Alpha. You have been cataloged as Category 3 sub-civilization. Resistance is not advised. Full compliance will result in orderly processing. You have 30 minutes to cease all communication and assemble in designated open areas. This is your only notification. Silence. Not silence, exactly. The alarm was still running. Briggs was already on a secondary frequency attempting to raise Earth Command. Somewhere outside the command post, she could hear the first collective sound of 60,000 people receiving the same message at the same moment. A low and shapeless noise that was not yet panic, but was building towards something. But in the command post itself, between the moment the broadcast ended and the moment Elena began issuing orders, there was a specific quality of quiet that she would remember for the rest of her life. The quiet of a thing that has landed and is waiting to see what moves next. 30 minutes. No terms, no contact frequency, no one to call. A timer and an instruction delivered to a world of 60,000 people, the way you might deliver a notice of demolition to a building whose occupants had not been consulted. Wade Briggs set down his headset and looked at her with the even expression of a man presenting a complete accounting of available facts. Both patrol ships offline simultaneously. No debris, no distress, 14 confirmed vessels in formation, each one larger than our entire orbital station. 200 soldiers with small arms and 3 crew-served weapons that have never been fired in operational conditions. He did not inflect any of it. He simply laid it out. Any rational calculation says we are done before we start. Elena was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the display, at the formation of vessels now fully visible in the lower atmosphere, at the clean absence of any orbital asset on any frequency. She thought about the voice that had come through every channel. Orderly processing. She turned that phrase over once and did not need to turn it again. She understood what was underneath it. I know what the rational calculation says, she said. Then she began issuing orders. The garrison mobilized in 7 minutes. 200 soldiers moving to pre-assigned defensive positions with the practiced efficiency of people who have drilled extensively, even if not for this particular scenario. The agricultural storage complex at the center of the settlement was the strongest structure on the surface, built to withstand the atmospheric pressure events that rolled across Kepler 7b every 18 months, thick walls and deep foundation and enough internal space to operate from. It was not a fortress. It was a granary that was going to have to function as one. Elena positioned her people, reviewed her inventory with the honest eye of someone who needed accurate numbers rather than reassuring ones, and thought carefully about what she had and what she was facing. Small arms primarily. 3 heavy weapons platforms retrieved from storage that had never been fired in operational conditions. Medical supplies calibrated for a peacetime garrison, which meant a fraction of what the next several hours would require. Communications that were currently useless across every primary frequency, and 200 soldiers trained for equipment disputes and boundary conflicts in the measured management of problems that responded to patient authority. She thought about the formation she had seen on the sensor display. 40 transport discs moving in a perfectly straight line, no variance, no scouting pattern, no tactical uncertainty in the approach. The Vreth soldiers aboard were visible at range, tall and rigid, covered in hard shell the color of old bone, moving with the mechanical precision of a procedure being executed. Not a battle being prepared, a collection being organized. That precision told her something important. A formation that does not scout does not expect to encounter anything that requires scouting. A column that advances in a straight line has run this approach enough times to know that straight lines work. They had arrived with the confidence of a system that had been reliable for a very long time, and that confidence had a specific quality that she recognized from a different context entirely. It was the confidence of something that had never been wrong. Cole Danvers found her at the eastern perimeter wall, watching the transport discs appear at the edge of the approach corridor. He had his rifle held with the careful grip of someone managing what his hands were doing, so he did not have to think about what his body wanted to do instead. "Captain?" "Danvers." He studied the approaching column for a moment. "They're not even looking at us. They haven't sent scouts. They're not checking our defensive positions." "No," she said. "Why not?" "Because in their experience, by the time they land, there's nothing to check." She watched the column advancing, the perfect spacing between vehicles, the calibrated pace of something that had been done the same way many times and expected to proceed the same way again. They didn't come here to fight us. They came here to collect what they already consider theirs. The 30 minutes was not a warning. It was logistics. Time to get the population into the right places so the process runs efficiently. He absorbed that for a moment. Around them, along the length of the perimeter wall, she could see her soldiers watching the same column with the specific attention of people who have decided something and are holding it steady. "So what do we do?" Danvers asked. She raised her voice so the soldiers along the wall could hear her clearly. "We make them fight for it." Danvers fired before any order was given. She understood it immediately. Fear had made him fast, faster than deliberation, faster than in the chain of command, and 2 shots left his rifle and found the front rank of the advancing column before the column had processed the fact of incoming fire. Both Vreth soldiers went down clean, not stumbled, not flinched backward, down, and the column stopped. The entire formation, simultaneously. Every transport disc, every soldier, complete cessation of forward movement for 1.8 seconds, and in the space of that pause there was something that felt, even at this distance, even through the particular lens of sustained adrenaline, like genuine surprise. Not tactical adjustment. Surprise. In 41 conquests spanning 3 centuries, covering worlds across the breadth of explored space, this had apparently not happened before. Someone had fired back before the collection began. The system had no subroutine for it because the system had never needed one. Elena was already shouting before the pause ended. Every soldier on the perimeter wall was firing, and the engagement that had not been planned and had not been rehearsed and had every reasonable argument against it began anyway. The way things begin when the alternative is sufficiently clear. Briggs was at her shoulder through the first 2 hours, and she used his steadiness the way you use a fixed point to orient yourself in moving water. He had been in combat enough times to carry it without performing it, and when the Vreth pushed forward with a second wave that was heavier and more coordinated than the first, he was already repositioning the left flank before she gave the order. When the first section of the eastern wall came down 30 minutes in, he had the fallback position established before the dust settled. "They're adjusting," he said during a brief lull, while the Vreth consolidated their position at the eastern approach. "Different angle on the second push. They varied the vehicle spacing." "How long did that take them?" He checked his display. 22 minutes from first contact." She filed that. "In 41 conquests, how many times had any adjustment been required?" The answer she would read in Dr. Lena Hart's report 6 months later was at most twice per campaign. A single adjustment was usually sufficient. The system had never been asked to adjust repeatedly against the same target because no target had been sufficiently persistent to require it. The cost of the first 2 hours was 17 soldiers. She read each name as the casualty reports reached her, and each one went into a specific interior place she was developing in real time. A place that was not indifference and was not numbness and was not anything she had precise language for yet. The place where necessary weight accumulates without compromising necessary function. She would spend years learning the maintenance of that place. The Vreth losses in the same period were 9. The ratio should have been far more lopsided. Their weapons were superior across every category. Their armor absorbed hits that her people could not absorb. Their numbers were larger and their discipline was absolute, and they carried 3 centuries of refined operational procedure. By every calculation available, the garrison should have yielded within the first hour. But the garrison had not yielded. Elena held the agricultural storage complex as the fighting moved through the settlement approach. She gave ground when holding it became more expensive than the ground was worth, and she made them pay for every meter they advanced in the hours accumulated in the fragmentary way that sustained combat produces time. A particular angle of light between 2 burning vehicles. The smell of the compound walls after the 3rd impact from a Vreth crew weapon. Danvers reloading beside her with the focused, unhurried movements of someone who has found a stillness in the middle of motion. At hour 4, a figure appeared between positions, moving with the purposeful directness of someone carrying something that needed to arrive. Nora Aldrich was a civilian engineer with oil on both hands and a practical clarity in her face that Elena recognized as the expression of a person who has identified a problem, solved it, and is now delivering the solution through the most direct route available. "I have a working communications relay," Aldrich said. "Low power, directional, buried under the water processing unit. Built it from components I had available in the maintenance stores. It will reach Earth command on the tertiary defense frequency if they're monitoring it." Elena looked at her for a moment. Nora Aldrich had no military rank. No one had given her an assignment. No one had told her what the situation required. She had assessed the situation herself, identified what was needed, and done it, without waiting for instruction or permission or assurance that it would matter. "How long has it been active?" 40 minutes. I tested stability before bringing it to you." "What's coming through?" Aldrich produced a printout. Elena read it twice. Kepler 7b was not alone. Every United States colony that the Vreth had targeted in their opening wave was engaged. 14 worlds. 43 separate points of contact. And at every single one of them, the response to the 30-minute ultimatum was the same. The populations had heard the voice coming through every channel and reached the same conclusion and refused to comply. Some had lost significant ground already. The larger garrisons were holding better. The smaller ones were sustaining casualties at rates that the printout described with a clinical restraint that could not conceal what the numbers actually meant. Not one world had surrendered. Elena handed the printout back to Aldrich. "Keep that relay running. Prioritize incoming traffic. I want everything Earth Command is transmitting." Aldrich was already moving. Briggs read the printout over her shoulder. He was quiet for a moment after she handed it back. 14 worlds, he said. 14 worlds. They planned on a rapid sequential collection. Come in, process one, move to the next. If every target is doing what we're doing, they have to commit real resources to each engagement, real time, real logistical attention. She was already working through what it meant at scale. Their system runs on certainty. The certainty that the outcome is predetermined before the first ship enters atmosphere. Take that away, and everything downstream changes shape. He looked at the perimeter, at the soldiers in their positions, at the smoke rising from 3 points along the eastern approach where the engagement had left its marks. "We're still losing ground." "Yes, but we're making them earn it, and that's something their system hasn't had to account for before." The broadcast had gone to the entire galaxy simultaneously. She would learn this later, reading the accumulated intelligence from the first months of the war. Standard Vreth procedure, a public notice of claim transmitted to every spacefaring civilization within range. In 41 previous instances, The notice had been received the way expected notices are received, as information rather than invitation, as a statement of an outcome already determined. 41 times the data had confirmed the expectation. The Vreth claimed a world, the world processed. The file closed. What the galaxy observed on this particular morning was not what any of them had organized a framework to observe. At hour 6, the secondary display registered a contact signature in the orbital debris field above the settlement. Elena was repositioning on the western fallback line when it appeared, and the icon that resolved on the display was one she had watched go dark 11 seconds after the colony alarm sounded. USS Resolute, patrol class, registry confirmed. She had not told Briggs what she had done in those 11 seconds. She had not told anyone because in the 11 seconds between the colony alarm and the moment the Vreth communications suppression reached full coverage, she had found a single open frequency and used it for a single instruction before it closed. The instruction had been 6 words: drift dark, make repairs, wait for my signal. She had not known whether the transmission had reached Lieutenant Greta Calloway on the Resolute. She had not known what condition the Resolute was in when the suppression hit. She had known only that if a trained officer with a functioning vessel understood that she had exactly one option remaining, she would find a way to use it. Greta Calloway and 11 crew members had spent 6 hours in the debris field near the orbital station with their transponders dark and their drive systems cold, presenting exactly the signature of a neutralized hulk drifting without power or crew. They had made emergency suit repairs in vacuum. Ma'am. 3 crew members had spliced a ruptured power coupling using wire stripped from eBay seat harnesses. The ship's chief engineer had held a primary conduit together with both hands for 40 minutes in hard vacuum, while her suit telemetry recorded conditions that the manual classified as unsurvivable without immediate intervention, and she had survived them because she had decided to. When Elena's signal reached orbital frequency, USS Resolute powered her main weapons in 90 seconds. The impact hit the Vreth command vessel in its lower section and rolled it hard before it stabilized. Not a killing strike. The vessel was too large and too heavily armored for Resolute's available weapons to deliver a killing result on a first pass. But the killing strike was not what mattered in that moment. What mattered was the data that propagated through the Vreth formation simultaneously. Every Vreth commander in the engagement received the same information at the same moment. A vessel that their systems had registered as neutralized, confirmed non-operational, eliminated from any tactical consideration, had fired on their command vessel from a position in the debris field where no functioning ship had any right to be. Their system said this was not possible. Every sensor reading, every scan, every protocol confirmation had agreed. That vessel was gone. The system had been wrong, and the wrongness was not a small variance or a marginal error. It was a categorical failure. Something that their models had eliminated from the space of possible outcomes had happened anyway. In the wider galaxy, other spacefaring civilizations were tracking the data from 14 worlds and running their own calculations. The consensus, assembled from the careful projections of species who had watched the Vreth operate before, was that humanity had weeks. A few estimates were generous enough to offer months. Not one across the breadth of every species observing that morning suggested years. Elena heard Resolute's weapons cycle on the secondary display and felt something shift beneath the surface of the engagement. Not the tactical situation, which remained exactly as difficult and expensive as it had been for 6 hours. Something below tactics, something in the quality of the Vreth command traffic, which had been running at an elevated rate since Danvers fired the first shots, and had now shifted to a compressed and urgent register that had a different quality than anything she had heard in the previous 6 hours. Briggs appeared behind her. He looked at the radar contact. At the Vreth command vessel still running corrective maneuvers. At the communication traffic cycling through the enemy formation with the specific urgency of a system encountering a category it had not been designed to handle. "You told Calloway to do that?" he said. It was not a question. "I told Calloway to wait for my signal. Before the suppression went up, you planned for it." "I hoped for it," she said. "Calloway made it real." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the radar display, at the contact that should not have been there and was. "That's our girl," he said. "That's our girl," Elena said. The situation on the ground had not changed its fundamental character. They were still being pushed back, still losing the approach corridor by degrees, still reading casualty reports with the steady focus of someone who needs the numbers to remain accurate. By the end of the hour 6, 23 soldiers were gone and the Vreth had taken 12. And the disproportion was real, but not what anyone on the Vreth side had projected when they calculated the morning's operational timeline. In the eastern settlement, Nora Aldrich sat at her relay station with a cut on her forehead she had not stopped to address, maintaining the connection that was the only thread of communication between Kepler 7b and a planet 4 light-years away that had not yet fully grasped what was happening at its edges. Along the perimeter wall, Cole Danvers was loading his rifle for the 4th time with the precise and unhurried movements of someone who has made a decision and is not currently reconsidering it. Elena stood at the fallback position with her map and her numbers and the particular clarity that settles in when everything external has been reduced to its essential components. She was 24 years old and she had been given a quiet posting and told to expect 18 uncomplicated months. She was 6 hours into something that was going to be neither quiet nor brief, and she could see clearly how many ways it ended badly. But she had watched an enemy formation stop. She had watched it stop because a soldier fired before any order was given, and the stopping had carried information. And she had watched a ship held together by stripped wire and human decision fire from a position that every sensor in the enemy formation had confirmed as empty. She thought about the voice that had come through every channel at 6:14 in the morning. Category 3 subcivilization. Orderly processing. The flat and efficient voice of a system that had calculated the same equation 41 times and found it reliable. The equation had a flaw built into it. The flaw had been here for a very long time. It loaded rifles and built relay stations and held conduits together in hard vacuum and had never in the entire documented history of its existence made the calculation easier to run. Elena Cross looked at her map and began planning the next 6 hours. Behind her, Nora Aldrich's relay crackled with a new transmission from Earth Command. More worlds reporting in. More names being added to a picture that was still, by every available measure, moving in the wrong direction. But not surrendering. Not from any world, in any transmission, on any frequency. Not one word that sounded like surrender. She pulled on her boot, which had come loose in the last movement through the rubble, and laced it, and went back to work. Whatever the Vreth had expected to find on Kepler 7b, it was not this. It was not 200 soldiers with no air support and no orbital cover and every rational argument available to them pointing toward compliance, who had instead chosen to make every meter of ground cost something real. Adjusting, adapting, filing every piece of information about how the enemy moved and what they valued and where their certainty came from. In 41 conquests, the Vreth had built a perfect and tested system for what followed the 30-minute ultimatum. The system rested on a single assumption, refined across 3 centuries of operational experience. Every species had a breaking point. Find it quickly, apply the correct pressure in the correct sequence, and the world yields. They had never fought a species that had spent 10,000 years learning, at the worst possible cost and in the worst possible classrooms, how not to break. They were about to begin that education. Part 2, the education begins 6 months into the war, Doctor. Lena Hart walked into the Nevada briefing room with a 40-page report and a look on her face that Elena Cross had learned to identify precisely. It was not the look of someone carrying good news. It was not the look of someone carrying bad news either. It was the expression of a scientist who has spent weeks staring at data that refuses to behave according to expectations, has finally accepted what the data is actually saying, and is now required to say it to people who may not have prepared themselves to hear it. Elena had been relocated to Earth Combined Command's Forward Analysis Facility outside Las Vegas 3 months after Kepler 7b. The colony was still contested, which remained a fact that the wider galaxy had not fully absorbed. She had been pulled from it and redistributed to a command structure that was trying to build a coherent operational picture from 43 separate engagements across 14 worlds, each one generating data and each one generating casualties, and none of them, considered alone, looking like anything other than a slow and expensive fighting retreat. The facility occupied a former nuclear test site. The choice had not been accidental. Hart set the report on the table and did not sit down immediately. "Before you read it," she said, I need to establish what it is not. Elena waited. It is not a victory narrative. I wrote the first sentence in large text because I knew the instinct would be to read everything following it as evidence that we are winning. Hart pulled out a chair and sat. We are not winning. The Vreth have taken 4 colony worlds. Their technology remains superior to ours in most categories. Their supply infrastructure is more established, their numbers are larger, and their command structure carries 3 centuries of operational refinement. On every objective measure, the war is still going their direction. Elena looked at the cover page. The first line read exactly as Hart had described. The Vreth are not losing, but they are not comfortable. And in a species that has never felt discomfort during a conquest, that discomfort is spreading through their command structure like a disease nobody has a name for yet. Tell me about the discomfort, Elena said. Hart had spent 12 years studying alien biology before the Vreth arrived. Atmospheric organisms on remote moons, deep water chemical ecosystems on ocean worlds. Patient, methodical work that had nothing to do with armed conflict and had not prepared her, in any conventional sense, for what Earth Combined Command was now asking her to do. What it had prepared her for was looking at biological systems without importing assumptions from outside them, taking data as it presented itself rather than as she expected it to present itself. The first thing I identified was adaptation rate, she said. In every previous Vreth campaign on record, they adjusted their tactics at most twice across the entire subjugation process. The target species would attempt a resistance. The Vreth would counter it. The species had no further answer because no species had the institutional infrastructure for sustained resistance. The process concluded. Against us? Against us, the Vreth have revised their ground tactics 14 times in 6 months. She let the number establish itself. We matched or answered 11 of those 14 revisions. Not because our commanders are individually exceptional, though some of them are. Because every soldier and officer in the American military has been trained on scenarios that begin with failure. Scenarios where communications are down, where the support that was promised doesn't arrive, where the rational outcome of a situation is bad and the job is to find a way through it regardless. She paused. Our military history is, at its core, a continuous curriculum in recovering from catastrophe. The Vreth have no equivalent curriculum. When their previous opponents encountered failure, they submitted. There was no next phase to prepare for. Elena studied the adaptation table. 14 revisions annotated with dates and engagement coordinates and the specific human responses that had forced each adjustment. Looking at the data laid out that way, she could see the shape of something the Vreth had not anticipated encountering. Not a stronger opponent, a more persistent one. An opponent that absorbed each new version of their approach and was working on an answer before the approach had fully deployed. The second finding is physiological, Hart said. It took me 2 full weeks to accept what I was reading. She turned to the relevant section and positioned the report where Elena could see the diagrams. Vreth soldiers have a neurological response to serious injury that suspends higher cognitive function. Not death. A forced shutdown. A biological protection mechanism that evolved over a very long time. A badly wounded Vreth soldier ceases to be a combatant almost immediately. The nervous system makes that determination autonomously. It overrides conscious choice. She traced the diagram. In its own way, it is a compassionate system. It is also the source of every projection error the Vreth have made about us. Elena looked at the diagram for a long moment. And our nervous systems don't do that, she said. Demonstrably not. Field medics across 43 engagements have reported soldiers continuing to function through conditions that have no precedent in any Vreth combat model. Injuries that, in Vreth physiology, produce immediate cessation of combat capacity. In human physiology, they produce something categorically different. Hart looked at the diagram. The soldiers continued anyway. Elena was quiet. Their casualty mathematics, she said, assumes a direct and reliable relationship between physical damage and fighting capacity. Against humans, that calculation is consistently wrong. Every projection they have run has required revision. They are not accounting for the correct variable. Hart looked at her directly. The variable is not capability, it is choice. Elena read the sentence twice, the difference between cannot stop and will not stop. Invisible in the Vreth data. Their models had no category for it because their models had been built on a biology that did not produce it, and they had never encountered a species whose biology worked differently until now. She set the report down and looked at the wall of the briefing room. Outside, the Nevada desert sat flat and patient and indifferent to the specific problems of the people who had buried a command center in its rock. She thought about the eastern perimeter wall on Kepler 7b, about the names she had read off casualty reports one by one, about Cole Danvers loading his rifle for the fourth time, about Greta Calloway holding a conduit together with both hands in hard vacuum because she had decided it was going to hold. So every time one of my people kept fighting through an injury, she said slowly, they were breaking a law of physics as far as the breath are concerned. Hart considered the phrasing. Essentially, yes. Good, Elena said. Let's keep breaking it. Hart almost smiled. It was the expression of a scientist who has spent 6 months in a room full of numbers and has just been reminded that the numbers are attached to something real. The third section of the report was the one Elena returned to most often in the weeks that followed. It concerned production. 6 months into the war, American manufacturing output had quadrupled. Not because new facilities had been constructed, though some were being built, but because every existing facility had been converted and reorganized and pushed past every previous operational threshold. Universities had redirected entire departments toward materials science and propulsion engineering. Companies that had spent decades producing agricultural equipment were turning out armored vehicle components. Engineers who had designed atmospheric management systems were applying the same fluid dynamics principles to weapons delivery. Young people were enrolling in accelerated technical programs at rates that no projection model had anticipated. Retired specialists were being recalled from retirements they had considered permanent. According to a captured Breath Field Intelligence report that Hart had appended to the section, the Breath review team had run the American production numbers 4 times before accepting them as accurate. The original analyst had filed a secondary report describing the situation as without known precedent in any archive campaign record. That secondary report had been received, filed, and dismissed. Elena read the dismissal notation and held it in her mind for a while. A system that was choosing not to listen to the people inside it who were telling the truth. She thought about a Vreth field commander designated Vorn, whose intercepts she had read that morning. 6 months of reports, beginning with the confident operational language of a commander executing a familiar process, moving through careful puzzlement in month 2, then something that read like controlled alarm filtered through the formal constraints of Vreth military convention. His final report, submitted before he was removed from command, read in translation, "The engagement parameters of this species do not conform to established models. Every projection has required revision. Recommend suspension of standard subjugation timeline pending thorough reassessment." In 41 conquests, no Vreth field commander had ever written a message like that. His superiors had removed him for what their internal records classified as performance deviation. Elena carried the printed translation to the operations room herself and pinned it to the center of the wall where everyone working in the room would see it every time they looked up from their stations. Briggs stood in front of it for a long moment when she put it up. He did not say anything. He nodded once, the particular nod of a man who has understood something without needing it decoded for him. The appointment came through 6 weeks after the Nevada briefing. Elena was named commanding officer of the first coordinated American expeditionary fleet, the first human offensive movement into Vreth-controlled space, not a response to a Vreth action. A choice made from the human side for the first time in the war. She stood on the observation deck at Luna Station and watched the fleet assemble across 3 days. Ship after ship taking its position, each one representing months of production and months of preparation, crewed by people who had 6 months of the hardest possible operational experience behind them and had come out of it knowing something precise about themselves that they had not known before. The fleet departed with 14 months of full operational supply capacity, not rationed, not emergency reserve. 14 months of continuous maintenance capacity carried with the fleet because Elena had read the production and logistics analysis carefully enough to understand what it was actually saying. The Vreth ran their campaigns fast, hit hard, collect submission, move to the next target. They had no extended supply doctrine because they had never needed one. Their campaigns had never lasted long enough to require it. She was going to give them a longer fight. Captain Rowan Vickers was her flag captain, precise and operationally thorough, with a gift for logistics that Elena valued above almost every other quality in her immediate command. He had disagreed with two of her decisions in the first month of the campaign. Both times he had stated his disagreement clearly, listened to her reasoning, and executed her orders without reservation. The first major engagement of the counteroffensive was at the Vreth defensive line anchoring Sector 9. Elena had studied the records of 3 previous human attempts to push through that sector and found the same pattern in each one. A strong initial push, a Vreth counter-response heavier than projected, a fighting withdrawal to previously held positions. The post-action analyses all concluded that the Vreth response time was impressive and that a different approach vector might produce a different result. Elena did not believe the problem was the approach vector. She believed the problem was that every previous commander had attempted to fight the Vreth on the terms the Vreth were most experienced with: direct engagement, force against force, pressure until one side yields. 3 centuries of experience had made the Vreth exceptional at exactly that contest. She was not going to be better at it. She was going to change what the contest was. The Vreth defensive line in Sector 9 broke faster than tactical projections had suggested. The formation was pulling back in visible disarray, and the corridor ahead was clear, and every voice on the command bridge that was not Elena Cross was saying the same thing with the same urgency: push forward, maintain momentum, keep them moving backward, do not allow stabilization. She ordered a complete stop, 6-hour rest cycle for all crews, maintenance checks fleet-wide, medical rotation, meal service. The silence on the command bridge lasted approximately 4 seconds. Vickers stated his concern in the careful, measured tone of a man who understood he was about to be overruled and was registering his position for the record. They will use those 6 hours to reorganize. They will try, Elena said. She was watching the display, watching the communication traffic cycling through the retreating Vreth formation with the compressed urgency of a system running an analysis. It does not have the right framework to run. But mostly they will spend those 6 hours trying to understand why we stopped. I would rather they work on that problem than on getting ready for us. Briggs, standing 3 feet to her left, said nothing at all. He looked at the display. He picked up his coffee from the console edge and took a long drink and set it back down and remained silent, which was his way of communicating that he had understood exactly what she was doing and had nothing to add. The 6 hours passed. The Vreth communication traffic ran at 3 times its normal rate and produced, as best the intercept team could translate in real time, a volume of analysis and very little actionable conclusion. They had an enemy that had broken their line and then inexplicably stopped advancing, for no tactical reason their models could identify, and the absence of a tactical explanation was the disruption she needed. A system built on certainty cannot operate cleanly in the presence of genuine uncertainty. The uncertainty was consuming operational attention that they could not afford to spend on it. When the rest cycle ended, Elena moved the fleet forward. The Vreth response was slower and less coordinated than it had been before the pause. She filed that the way she filed everything. The engagement her fleet came to call the doorstep happened at a navigational choke point, her charts designated Junction Point Kappa, a natural bottleneck between 2 dense asteroid fields at the edge of Vreth-controlled space. The defensive line anchoring it had held for 3 weeks before Elena arrived. It was commanded by Grand Commander Thal, a veteran officer whose service record showed 22 years of successful defensive operations across 6 campaign theaters. He had never lost a defensive position. His reputation across the Dominion was built on tactical precision and absolute composure under sustained pressure. Elena parked her fleet in front of his line and waited. Small probing actions launched on irregular schedules, achieving nothing decisive and withdrawn before they could develop into sustained engagements. Crew rotations every 6 hours to keep everyone sharp and rested. Resupply from the mobile logistics depot. Maintenance. The ordinary routine of a fleet that was in no particular hurry. From the outside, it looked exactly like indecision. It looked like a commander who had assessed the defensive line and found it too strong to take, who was searching for an angle and not finding one. It looked like a fleet that had momentum and lost its nerve at the crucial moment. It looked precisely and deliberately like weakness. On the fourth day, Thal's internal communications began reaching the intercept team at elevated frequency. By the seventh day, his reports had a compressed and accelerating quality that Elena recognized from Vorn's intercepts 6 months earlier. The language of an experienced commander encountering a situation his training had not equipped him to classify. He could not find a precedent for an opponent that maintained strength at his perimeter without pressing an assault or acknowledging an inability to press one. He could not identify which of the possible threats the behavior was building toward. And so, because he was a careful and disciplined commander, he prepared for all of them simultaneously, maintaining his entire defensive complement at full operational readiness around the clock, keeping his rapid response units on standby rather than rotating them through rest cycles, sustaining a posture that had been designed to be temporary and was now entering its second week. To sustain it, he began drawing on reserves. Elena's intelligence team flagged the supply chain movements on day 8. Thal was redirecting logistics allocated to the secondary defensive layer behind his position in order to maintain the extended readiness posture at the primary line. The resources that had been designated to prepare that secondary layer for the phase of the campaign that came after this engagement were being consumed by the engagement itself, day by day, before it had even been decided. Briggs brought her the intercept summary in person. He stood in the doorway of her command room and held it out and waited while she read it. She read it twice. His fuel reserves, she said, at 60% this morning, down from full operational at the start of the engagement. Briggs kept his voice even. The ordnance resupply designated for the secondary position has been redirected to primary defensive maintenance. The secondary layer has been operating on existing stock for 6 days. Elena looked at the tactical display, at the defensive line that had never been broken, at the space behind it where a secondary defensive layer was supposed to be fully prepared and was not. Day 12, she said, the numbers support that. She spent a moment longer looking at the display, thinking about Thal on the other side of that line, a careful officer who had made every correct decision available to him within the framework of a system that had not given him the right tools for this particular contest. He had been fighting a defensive engagement. She had been fighting his supply chain from the beginning. The distinction was the entire battle. On day 12, she ordered the full assault. Thal's line held for 9 hours, which was a remarkable performance given what had been done to it over the previous 11 days. And Elena acknowledged that internally even as she pressed the attack. He held 9 hours, and then the left flank gave way under sustained pressure, and then the center followed. And he pulled his remaining forces back in good order because he understood when a position had become indefensible, and he made the correct call when that moment arrived. But he was retreating into a secondary defensive layer that had been waiting on existing stock for 6 days and had counted on his whole buying at preparation time he had been unable to provide. Elena went through the secondary layer in 36 hours. She would not pretend the offensive was clean. The fleet lost ships. The fleet lost crews. Some of those losses were people whose names she had been reading in briefings and reports long enough that they had become as familiar as the layout of her own command bridge. People who would come to her in the hours before she was fully awake some mornings and had not stopped coming since. Those losses went into the place she had been building since Kepler 7b, the specific interior space that was not indifference and was not suppression and was not something she had adequate language for. Just the place where necessary weight lives. She would not dress any of it in language that made it easier to hold. There was no version of the story where those losses were anything other than what they were. But the fleet was moving. The initiative had shifted, and the Vreth were responding to human decisions rather than the other way around. And the shift had not come from superior technology or overwhelming force. It had come from a logistics study written about a continental war fought on Earth 3 centuries before Elena was born, and a conclusion stated simply enough that she had built an entire campaign architecture around it. In every sustained conflict examined, the decisive factor was not who had better weapons. It was who could keep fighting after everyone expected them to stop. She had given the Vreth a long fight. She had given them something their system had never modeled, and their commanders had received no training for. Sector 9 opened behind the fleet, Sector 10 6 weeks later. The boarding operation at the captured command station in Sector 11 was Elena's decision, and her senior officers objected to it with the focused precision of people who had very specific and well-founded reservations about their fleet commander leading a boarding team in person. Vickers stated his objection in 3 carefully constructed sentences and stopped when he understood that Elena was going to do it regardless, and further argument was a use of time they could not afford. She had spent 7 months absorbing the Vreth through layers of analysis and intercept summary and translated documentation, and the accumulated understanding was operationally thorough and had been used to make good decisions. But it was a picture built from data, and data does not shake your hand. The station commander was among the most senior military ranks the Vreth possessed. His designation translated it to High Commander Dreth. He was tall and formally composed, carrying the ceremonial markings of his rank. And when Elena's team entered his command chamber, he was standing in a posture that her cultural briefing had described, but that looked different in person than any description could fully prepare her for. He was waiting to be killed. The posture communicated it precisely. A Vreth commander who had lost his station had, by the complete logic of his civilization's military code, concluded his function. The story was over. He was standing in the posture of someone who had accepted that conclusion and was ready for what followed from it. Elena walked across the command chamber and held out a datapad. He looked at it, he looked at her, he looked at the datapad again. The translation unit processed for a moment, working through the gap between the words on the pad and the nearest available concepts in Vreth language architecture. "What is this?" his translator produced. "Terms of negotiation," Elena said. The unit cycled again. The closest phrase it could construct was something like, "Conditional cessation protocol offered by lower-ranked party." "We are not the lower-ranked party," Elena said. Dreth was still for a long time. She watched him and understood that she was watching a system encountering a category it had never needed to develop. Not submission, not destruction, not any outcome that 3 centuries of campaign experience had produced a protocol for. Something else entirely, offered from a position of tactical dominance without ceremony or anger, or any visible need to demonstrate the dominance that had already been demonstrated. Elena sent him back to the Dominion with the datapad and a complete record of the current human fleet strength in position. Not a threat. Information. The Vreth made decisions based on clear and accurate data. She was providing clear and accurate data and letting them make the decision. Briggs was at the command bridge when she returned to her ship. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has been in this particular business long enough to have developed a comprehensive filing system for unusual events and was not entirely certain which drawer this one belonged in. "Did it work?" he asked. "Not yet," Elena said, "but it will." She moved to the tactical display and began reviewing the fleet status. The work was not finished, and the decisions ahead were not small ones, and the names accumulated in that interior place were not going to become lighter. There was more to do before there was anything that could be called an ending. But the Vreth communications traffic had changed in quality in the hours since the boarding. The intercept team had noted it without fully characterizing it. A different tempo, a different kind of attention being paid to a different set of questions. They were trying to understand what had happened. She had met them at the moment of their expected conclusion and handed them something their entire system had no category for, something that was going to require them to build a new one. 6 weeks, she said. Vickers looked up from his station. "Sir? They'll open a formal channel within 6 weeks. He looked at the display for a moment, at the position markers, at the supply calculations, at the long shape of a campaign that had been built from a logistics study and a morning when the sky turned the wrong color and a soldier fired before any order was given. 6 weeks and 4 days later, the Vreth High Council opened a formal communication channel. Part 3. Forward is the only direction the Vreth homeworld was cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. Elena Cross stepped off the transport onto the landing platform of Vreth Prime and felt the chill settle into her joints within the first few minutes, a deep and persistent cold that the atmospheric readings had approximated but not fully conveyed. The sky above was dark gray-green, heavy with clouds that moved slowly and did not break. The buildings of the capital district rose in every direction, tall and angular, constructed entirely to purpose. No curves, no decoration, no concession to any quality that did not serve a function. Everything built to last, everything built to work, nothing built for anything else. Looking at those buildings, Elena understood something about the Vreth that 7 years of intelligence reports had circled without landing on directly. They had not chosen efficiency as a philosophy. Efficiency was simply the default condition of their existence. Their entire civilization had organized itself around the elimination of waste. Wasted time, wasted material, wasted motion, wasted coordination between independent entities operating without central direction. Their conquest program, at its deepest structural level, was a resource management system, an empire-wide effort to eliminate what they had classified as the inefficiency of uncoordinated civilizations doing independently what could be done more effectively together under unified administration. That understanding did not make what they had done acceptable. It made them real in a way that reading files had never accomplished. Years of data and analysis and translated intercepts had given her a thorough operational picture of the Vreth. Standing on their world, breathing their cold air, looking at the buildings they had built to last forever because lasting was efficient, she had a different kind of understanding, the kind that requires presence rather than information. She was 31 years old. She had been 24 when the sky changed color over Kepler 7b, and in the 7 years between those two mornings she had covered distances she could not meaningfully measure, and lost people whose names came to her before she was fully awake some mornings and had not stopped coming. She looked at herself in mirrors sometimes and needed a moment. Sergeant Major Wade Briggs stepped off the transport behind her, carrying a field pack he had been carrying variants of for more years than he would specify and showed no signs of reconsidering. He looked at the Capital District for a long moment without expression. "Quiet," he said. "Yes. Not the quiet of a place at peace." He adjusted the pack strap with the habitual motion of a man who has made that particular adjustment 10,000 times. The quiet of a place that doesn't know what it is yet. The Vreth Dominion's collapse had been rapid in the way structural collapses are always rapid once the load-bearing assumptions fail. 900 million people on Vreth Prime alone, navigating an existence that the framework of the previous 3 centuries had not prepared any of them for. 40% of the population was warrior caste or caste adjacent, their entire social identity organized around expansion operations that no longer existed. The supply networks those operations had sustained were gone. The purpose they had provided was gone. 4 out of every 10 people on this world had no established framework for what they were supposed to do now. The American reconstruction team was 42 people from 6 states. Engineers, medical staff, logistics specialists, 1 xenobiologist, and Elena, appointed team lead with the specific instruction from Ambassador Bernard Hale's office that their role was liaison and support, not direction. "We are here to help carry out decisions the Vreth Transitional Council makes, not to make those decisions for them." She had read that instruction carefully and agreed with it completely. The Vreth liaison officer assigned by the Transitional Council was waiting in the intake bay of the compound on the eastern edge of the Capital District. His designation translated to Compliance Administrator Keth. He was tall, as all Vreth were, and his shell carried a paler coloration than the warrior caste officers Elena had encountered across command chambers in boarding operations. He stood with a careful stillness when Elena entered the bay, and the stillness was not the composed readiness of military Vreth. It was the stillness of someone managing something. Dr. Owen Marsh, the team's xenobiologist, leaned toward Elena as they crossed the bay. "His shell is shifting at the shoulder junction," he said quietly. "I have documentation on that specific movement pattern. It's the Vreth equivalent of anxious fidgeting. He's nervous about meeting us." Considerably. That landed differently than Elena had prepared for. She had spent 7 years building a mental image of the Vreth from engagement records and tactical analyses, and the specific quality of attention you develop for an enemy whose capabilities you are trying to accurately assess. The image was detailed and had been operationally useful. It had almost nothing to do with the individual standing in the intake bay, hoping the meeting would go adequately. She crossed the bay and stopped at a reasonable distance and let the translation unit do its work. "Administrator Keth, my name is Elena Cross. I'm leading the American Reconstruction Liaison Team." She kept her voice direct and even, the way she spoke to anyone she was meeting for the first time and intended to work with seriously. "We are here to work with your Transitional Council on Infrastructure and Supply Restoration. We are not here to direct your decisions. We are here to help carry them out." Keth's translator processed for a moment. "You are smaller than I expected," it rendered. Behind her, Wade Briggs made a sound that was not quite a cough. Fair enough, Elena said. The work began the following morning and did not stop for 42 days. It was hard in a way that was entirely unlike combat. Combat had a direction. The problem was coming from somewhere identifiable, and you pushed back against it with everything available. Reconstruction had no direction. Problems arrived from all sides simultaneously, all equally urgent, none of them responsive to force. The Vreth civilian infrastructure was functional in isolation, but had been designed to route resources inward from occupied worlds. That pipeline was gone. Everything that had sustained the capital district's population had been built to receive from outside, not to generate from within. On the fourth evening, Keth sat across the planning table from Elena, with a supply network map between them, and spoke in the careful way he used when he was processing something that was difficult to articulate. The council built all of this to move outward, he said, his translator rendering the words with the flat efficiency that Vreth communication typically produced. None of it was designed to move inward. Everything was built to take, not to circulate. Elena looked at the map. That is something you can change. He looked at her. Can it be changed? Yes, it is hard, and it takes time, and it requires convincing a great many people who benefited from the old system that the new one is worth their effort. But it is possible. We know it is possible because we have done it. A pause. Not perfectly, not always, but enough times to know the direction is right. Keth was quiet for a while in the particular way he was quiet when he was processing something that did not fit neatly into the categories his experience had given him. Your species changes direction, he said finally. Sometimes, when we manage to agree on which direction to go. Your internal political communications suggest that agreement is not always straightforward. It was the most accurate description of the current situation in Washington that Elena had encountered from any source. No, she said, it is not always straightforward. Back on Earth, the political situation was exactly as complicated as Keth had identified. Ambassador Hale's twice-weekly briefings described a faction within the Earth Council organizing under the name the Security and Reparation Alliance that was pressing for an extraction agreement with the Vreth. Formal reparations structured as raw material access, resource leases, mandatory technology transfers. The numbers they proposed were not accidentally punitive. They were designed to ensure Vreth economic dependency for decades, and the people proposing them were experienced enough to know precisely what they were designing. Dr. Lena Hart had submitted a secondary analysis from the Nevada facility showing that a Vreth civilization maintained in structured dependency was several times more likely to produce a serious destabilization event within 20 years than one given a genuine framework for recovery. The Security and Reparation Alliance called it speculative. Ambassador Hale sent Elena a short personal message in the second week. It said, "What you find on the ground matters. Write it down, send it, all of it." So she did. She wrote about the Vreth children in the food distribution lines, their shells pale and their movements carrying a quiet uncertainty that had nothing in common with the rigid efficiency of the adults around them. Children look like children in a food distribution line, regardless of species. She had not expected to find that true. She wrote about the residential districts where entire caste compounds had gone silent because the social structures that had defined them no longer existed and no guidance had arrived about what was supposed to come next. She wrote about the craft work she found in the market areas, unexpected and intricate, geometric and genuinely beautiful, made by people who had apparently been producing it privately for years because their caste code had not included it as an authorized activity. Art made in secret by a civilization that had classified art as inefficiency. She sent everything to Hale without editing it. Then the message arrived that changed the shape of everything. It came through Vel's diplomatic channel, routed to Hale and forwarded to Elena with a 3-word personal note. Do not wait. Vel had spent the previous night in a room with a representative whose government had not authorized them to be there. What that representative said took 11 minutes to transmit and 2 hours for Elena to fully absorb. 2 species, currently listed in assembly documentation as having voluntarily reduced contact with the wider galactic community. They had not reduced contact voluntarily. The Vreth had been conducting quiet extraction operations on their worlds for 11 years, running the operations through administrative paperwork the Galactic Neutral Assembly had approved without thorough review. The paperwork had been filed correctly. The oversight had not happened. 62 civilizations had been watching humanity's war and had not noticed two quiet worlds going dark in their administrative records. Elena sat with that for a long time. Then she sent two instructions. The first went to Ambassador Hale. Withdraw the membership application before the session opens and file an emergency investigative commission through every available back channel. The second went to Captain Vickers, who was maintaining two fleet assets in the region pending reassignment. Redirect to the affected systems immediately and file it as welfare verification transit. No one had asked her to do it. There was no political calculation behind it, no strategic gain, no leverage being built. The Security and Reparation Alliance would use it against her. 3 assembly members filed formal protests within the hour, citing lack of standing. All 3 withdrew their protests before the session convened the following morning. Vel messaged Hale that evening. The message reached Elena while she was reviewing water distribution schematics with Keth. They watched her ships move, it said, and they decided they want humanity on the right side of whatever comes next. The vote passed the following afternoon. Not unanimously. The Garathi abstained, as did 2 others. But the margin was one that no one in that chamber had considered possible at the start of the session. Hale's message to Elena was 4 words. We have a seat. She read it once, filed it in the place where the weight of important things accumulates, and went back to the water distribution schematic. Keth was waiting with a question about the Eastern Junction, and the Eastern Junction needed an answer more urgently than the moment needed ceremony. The final agreement on reparations came through in the 4th week. The Security and Reparation Alliance's most aggressive proposals had failed their votes by margins that had not existed 3 weeks earlier. The framework that emerged included material assistance obligations structured as temporary and declining, tied to benchmarks for Vreth's civic stability rather than to extraction timelines. A defined path toward genuine recovery rather than managed dependency. It was not perfect. The representatives who had wanted harder terms were still present and still watching, ready to revisit the question if conditions shifted. That pressure was not going away. But the framework was something Elena could look at without flinching. The hardest day came in the 5th week. A community in the Eastern Capital District had been experiencing sustained civil tension between former warrior caste residents and the technical caste population sharing the district. The technical caste residents were adjusting. They had skills the new economy could use immediately and a social identity that did not depend on the Dominion structure to remain coherent. The warrior caste residents had neither. They had held status and purpose within a system that no longer existed, and the gap between where they had been and where they were was a pressure with nowhere constructive to go. Keth proposed going to the district together without official escort. He had assessed his own people, and Elena trusted his read over the briefing documents. They spent 4 hours in a community hall with former warrior caste residents who had never been in a room with a human. The conversation moved slowly through the translation units with the particular awkwardness of people attempting communication across a gap that had, until recently, been expressed exclusively through weapons fire. They asked Elena things that no analysis had captured. Not tactical questions, not strategic assessments. Questions about what it had been like to fight them, asked with the directness the Vreth used for all genuine inquiry. She answered honestly because she was too tired, at this point in her life, for any other approach. It was the most frightening experience I have ever had, she told them, and also the most clarifying. When everything else falls away and the only real question is whether you are going to keep moving forward or stop, you find out something about yourself very quickly. A silence in the room. Then an old warrior caste Vreth, his shell carrying the deep amber pigmentation that Vreth biology associated with advanced age, spoke with the deliberate care of someone choosing each word before placing it. Your species was afraid, he said, and continued anyway. Yes, our doctrine classifies that as irrational behavior. Elena looked at him across the table and thought about Cole Danvers firing before any order was given because fear had made him fast. She thought about Greta Calloway holding a conduit in hard vacuum because she had decided it was going to hold. She thought about Nora Aldrich building a relay under a water processing station because she had looked at a situation, identified what was needed, and done it. Your doctrine was wrong about us, she said. The old warrior caste Vreth was quiet for a long time. Then he made a gesture. Owen Marsh, sitting to Elena's left, went very still in the way he went still when he was connecting something to something else in the extensive archive he carried in his head. Later, walking back through the Capitol District in the cold gray-green afternoon, he told her what he had found. That gesture, he said, I checked it against everything in the xenobiological documentation, every record of Vreth physical communication available to us. He paused. It is the expression of acknowledgement between two individuals who have reached a genuine understanding across a significant divide. Not tactical acknowledgement, not procedural recognition. The documentation notes it as rare. Elena thought about that. What did you do when he made it? I nodded back. He considered that for a moment. That was probably exactly right. On the morning of the 42nd day, a message arrived on the combined command frequency outside the normal briefing schedule. It was from Ambassador Hale, marked urgent, forwarding a transmission from the observer Vel through a secure diplomatic channel. Hale's personal note was 3 words. Read this carefully. Elena read it at the small desk in the compound room that had become hers over 6 weeks on Vreth Prime. Outside the window, the dark gray-green sky sat low, and the wind moved through the Capitol District with the patience of something that had been doing it for a very long time. The transmission was detailed and measured, written in the careful language of a professional observer who had spent years choosing words with precision, and between the lines of that professional care, there was something Elena recognized as the particular gravity of information that changes the shape of everything around it. Long-range probes at the outer boundary of former Vreth-controlled space had been returning signals for 8 months. The signals had been analyzed by 3 independent teams, cross-referenced, reanalyzed, and confirmed. They were not random. They were not natural sources. They were recordings, directed and regular and methodical, documenting the entirety of the 4-year war from a considerable distance. Every major engagement captured, every fleet movement logged. The complete arc of the conflict, from the first broadcast over Kepler 7b to the armistice negotiations, recorded in full from a position outside any known location in the map galaxy. Whatever was producing the signals was not in any database available to any species that had ever filed documentation with the Galactic Neutral Assembly. Vel had added a second element. The Vreth High Council held a classified historical archive that had not been included in the materials surrendered during the armistice process. Vel had accessed a partial summary through channels the note declined to specify in writing. The archive documented contacts at the outer boundary going back nearly 2 centuries. Brief contacts, each one quickly concluded, each one assessed by the Vreth command structure of the period as beyond current engagement capacity and flagged for future strategic consideration. 2 centuries of contacts, 2 centuries of the same notation in varying language, beyond current capacity, deferred to future strategic review. The Vreth had reached for that future review many times and had never arrived at it. They had been stopped definitively by a species they had classified as a rapid subjugation target, and now humanity was standing at the edge of a deferred future that 2 centuries of an empire had never been able to reach. Something patient had watched the entire war, something methodical enough to document every engagement across 4 years, something that had made the Vreth nervous enough 200 years ago to bury the record in a sealed archive and say nothing about it to anyone in the galaxy. Elena read the message 3 times. Then she sat for a while at her desk, not reading anything, not planning anything, just sitting with the weight of what the message contained and giving it the time it required to fully settle. Outside, she could hear Keth's voice coordinating with the supply teams over the water reclamation project. The junction in Sector 4 had cleared yesterday, and line restoration was projected for end of day. Owen Marsh was in the eastern end of the compound working through medical supply logistics for the clinic. Wade Briggs was somewhere nearby, probably with coffee, probably quiet. 42 people from 6 American states, doing the slow and difficult and entirely unglamorous work of helping a broken civilization find a way to be something other than what it had been. The kind of work that has no clean endpoint and no ceremony attached to it, and no moment where you look at a display and see the objective confirmed complete. She wrote a reply to Hale and Vel. She kept it short. We finish what we started here, completely and right. Then we face whatever is next together, with everything on the table and no comfortable assumptions. That is the only way we have ever managed anything that actually lasted. She sent it and went outside. The cold settled into her joints the way it always did within the first minutes of being out here. The sky was the same low gray-green it had been every morning for 6 weeks. Keth was at the supply table with 3 junior coordinators, pointing at a schematic of the Eastern Water Distribution Network with the focused attention he brought to everything regardless of scale. He looked up when Elena approached. "The reclamation junction in Sector 4 is cleared," he said. "Line restoration can begin before end of day." "Good. Your medical officer confirms the Eastern District Clinic is fully operational as of this morning." "Good," she said again. Keth made the gesture. She recognized it now without needing Owen Marsh to explain it. Recognized the meaning that the documentation had described as rare. The acknowledgement between two individuals who had crossed a significant distance to reach something like understanding. She nodded back because it had been exactly right in the community hall, and she understood it was exactly right now. Wade Briggs appeared at her side with his thermos and 2 field cups and poured without asking. She took the cup. The coffee was the variety of terrible that field coffee always was, dense and slightly metallic, with a suggestion of the container it had been sitting in. But it was hot, and the cold was in her joints, and the hot was what mattered. They stood together for a while without speaking, watching Keth's team work through the supply schematic. Briggs had the quality of silence that comes from understanding precisely when words are needed and when their absence is the correct offering. After a while, he said, "The message from Vel." "Yes," he looked at the sky. "Something out there, watching. Something that has been watching since the beginning. Something patient enough to document the whole war without announcing itself." The Vreth knew about it. For nearly 2 centuries. Never got around to dealing with it. He drank his coffee. They were busy processing civilizations. "And now it is our problem instead." He looked at the Capital District, at the angular buildings going about their morning in the quiet way of a place still deciding what it was. At Keth's team bent over the schematic. At 2 Vreth children crossing the far end of the compound yard with the purposeful uncertainty that children carry everywhere regardless of species. "Not yet it isn't," he said. "First we finish this." "Yes." "Then we figure out that." "Yes." He poured more coffee into her cup without being asked. She reached into her jacket pocket and found the ration pack she had put there the previous afternoon and had not gotten around to eating. And she opened it and stood there in the cold morning air of a world that had been an enemy capital 7 years and a lifetime ago. It was not good food. Dense and dry, carrying the flavor of compressed material and a distant suggestion of something that had once been bread. Nothing like home. Nothing like the kind of unhurried breakfast that belongs to mornings when nothing particular is coming. She thought about the morning 7 years ago when she had been sitting at a desk writing a routine administrative report and the sky had changed color and the alarm had screamed and she had picked up her rifle and gone outside with one boot unlaced to find out what had ended the world she had been living in that morning. That morning existed fully in her memory now only because it was gone. Ordinary mornings only become recognizable as ordinary once you are no longer in them. This was not that morning. This was dry rations on a cold alien world with work that would take years more and problems that had no clean solutions, in something unknown and patient waiting past the boundary of everything humanity had mapped. Watching and recording and waiting with the patience of something that had been waiting for 2 centuries already. But the sky above her was still, no amber burning from east to west. No sound of anything falling or breaking or arriving to collect on a decision already made. Just the cold and the wind and the sound of Keth's team working on the water lines, and somewhere across the compound, the low, steady voice of Owen Marsh going through a logistics checklist with the methodical attention of a man who understood that the unglamorous work was the work that actually mattered. Whatever was out there past the boundary, watching and recording and waiting, it was going to find out the same thing the Vreth had found out. The same thing 41 previous civilizations had apparently not provided occasion to discover. It was going to find out that humanity did not stop when the math said to stop, did not yield when the rational calculation said yielding was the only remaining option. Got tired and got hurt and lost people and kept going anyway. Not because it was braver than other species or stronger or more capable, but because somewhere inside the long and brutal and expensive history of everything it had survived, It had learned something that cannot be taught any other way. That destruction is not a final state. That catastrophe is a problem with a solution and a lesson with a use. That every ending is also a foundation if you are willing to do the work of finding out what it can bear. Elena finished the ration pack. She folded the wrapper carefully and put it in her jacket pocket because she had learned years ago not to leave things behind that she did not have to. The cold was in her joints and the coffee was gone, and the 42nd day was beginning in the way days begin when the work is not finished and the next necessary thing is waiting. She looked at the sky one more time. 7 years ago, a voice had come through every channel at 6:14 in the morning and announced that humanity had been cataloged and assigned and scheduled for orderly processing, that its story was finished, that the only remaining question was how efficiently the conclusion could be organized. The voice had been wrong, not because humanity was exceptional in the ways the voice had failed to measure, but because the voice had been built by a system that had never once considered it might encounter something its measurements did not capture. A system that had run the same equation 41 times and found it reliable, and had stopped asking whether the equation was complete. The equation was not complete. Elena Cross tucked the ration wrapper into her pocket, turned back toward the supply table where Keth was waiting, with a question about the Eastern Junction that needed an answer, and walked forward into the 42nd morning of work that had no end date and no ceremony attached to it, and no guarantee of anything except that it was necessary, and she was here to do it. Whatever was watching from the dark at the edge of the mapped galaxy was going to find that out. They all did, eventually.